It is 2/23 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Jenson's speculative doctrine of Christology. We just finished up his Petrology, and we'll take a look at his systematic Christology and the way that remains consistent with his Petrology that we've already finished. It's also included in the second half of the book where he proposes his more speculative doctrines. So we'll take a look at this. It's going to be a basic triad again. I found that his Christology is pretty much anchored in Karl Barth and Hegel, which there was a period during his studies when he did gain an interest in Hegel, and we're going to see that here. So it's primarily a compilation of Barth and Hegel, which remains consistent with his Catholic and evangelical outlook. So we'll take a look at this Christology. It's very compact, 10 pages, and it's loaded with information. So it's pretty much like the Petrology. It's dense logic, but it's just 10 pages. A 10-page concentrated effort at a Christology. The triad will consist of number one, the divinity of the Son. The number two, second moment, will be the finitude or incarnation of the Son. And the third moment will be the communal synthesis. He calls it a communal synthesis of the two natures to constitute the lordship of the Son. So we'll look at divinity first. Basically, according to Jenson, Jesus' natures are not to be counted as independent metaphysical existence. Those kind of ideas must be negated. We must negate that impassibility of the metaphysical when we discuss the two natures. The pre-existing logos is a subsisting relation to the Father, as was previously discussed. The Son is one personality in the tri-mutuality of divine life. One personality in the tri-mutuality of divine life. Now, when we discuss the pre-existence of Christ, any idea of a timeless, impassible being must be absolutely negated. So he gives us his personal take on what it means to speak of pre-existence concerning Christ. And he gives us 6 aspects. First, God's being is contained by the notion of decision. He gets that from Barth. What God is, he chooses. Second, the doctrine of election constitutes God's being. Third, God's choice of union with humanity therefore defines the Son. So fourth point, big point, the tendency toward incarnation is inherently present within the Father, which presupposes the Son. Therefore, God's inherent precondition to incarnate. God's inherent precondition to incarnate equals the Son's preexistence. That is preexistence for Jenson. God's inherent precondition to incarnate. That's Hegel all the way. It's the inherent tendency to enter into finitude through incarnation. That precondition equals preexistence. Therefore, the Son preexists as latent narrative pattern within the Father. In other words, a inherent divine pattern of movement through incarnation. An inherent divine pattern of movement through incarnation which is already possessed by the Father. Now, when discussing the birth of Christ, he has his own very specific take. Christ's sonship is determined from his resurrection. Christ's sonship comes from God's future in which he was raised. Christ's entire ministry is to be understood as a trajectory empowered by God's pressing futurity of the kingdom. The pressing futurity of the kingdom. So 4, Christ's birth takes place from the eternal eschatological life of God. from the eternal eschatological life of God, which includes the seed of David. So the Son is begotten through the freedom of the Father, which is Spirit, and it is an eschatological being born of the life of God. So that gives us his very unique drawing together of two schools, Barth and Hegel, to give us the idea of the Son's divinity. And he does the same in finitude, obviously, because now we're going to talk about that going out, that inherent intentionality to go out of God's self into finitude. So when we look at the finitude of the Son, Jenson calls it the communal finite life of the suffering servant. This is incarnation as suffering servant. Now, number one, the Son's historical human life is acknowledged in its soteria salvation role. This finite actuality is depicted as perfect obedience within this soteria salvation role. The incarnate Son suffers as is freely asserting obedience to the Father, and we touch this suffering servant through the sacrament. Now, the incarnate Son begins as the primitive I, like any other human being. But, according to Jenson, he also lives in the tri-mutual life of God. Remember, in that ousia space, the Son lives in this thread of divine history, which is woven throughout the historical temporal narrative. The Son lives in a thread of divine history, which is woven throughout the historical temporal narrative. So there's this incarnate divine history that incarnates the historical temporal history. So this thread of divine history throughout temporal history includes the Son's suffering of all contingencies. Remember, God is the God who inherently desires to enter into finitude and contingency. The Son suffers all these contingency. And then Jenson says he concludes these sufferings in his execution on the cross, the crucifixion, which thereby provides the promise of transcendence over the contingency and the inconsistency in contingency through the actuality of the resurrection. So the resurrection qualifies this conclusive suffering, which ended in the execution on the cross, by through the resurrection opening up the promise of transcendence over inconsistency through this resurrection. So that takes us on to the eschatological synthesis of which is communal, according to Jenson. He says the divine nature and the human nature must achieve concrete synthesis in a way other than the abstract. It must be communal, and this communal synthesis equals the one and sameness of consistency within the temporal inconsistency. So it's that type of a transcendence. And this one and sameness reaches and attains to what Jenson calls the unifying logos of divinity in actuality. So we have this Hegelian return moment as the unifying logos of divinity in actuality. A unifying logos, a unifying communal logos. And so this all is very, very much in tune with Barth and Hegel. I think it's pretty obvious here. We've got that inherent intentionality to incarnate through finitude, which means the willingness to take on suffering. And so the Son, the incarnate Son, becomes a suffering servant through his obedience of being a suffering servant, and then through crucifixion that is qualified by resurrection, we reach the promise of transcendence, which is a unifying logos of transcendence. And that'll wrap us up. A very brief look, but a very quick look at his speculative Doctrine of Christology, pages 135 through 145.